Watson Shennan, the pioneer of New Zealand sheep farming in the southern hinterland.
Watson Shennan was born in Galloway in 1835 and he grew up here at Laidloch Farm in Kirkpatrick, Durham Parish. His father was an award-winning breeder of Galloway cattle and his grandfather had been a leading agriculturalist in this region. The Shennan family had interest in a number of farms in this area and they were clever, successful farmers at the cutting edge of Scottish agricultural developments. But they were still only tenants and there were too many of them. Alexander and Watson were 2 of 11 children, 8 of them boys. The family farms were substantial by Scottish standards, but they were never going to provide a living for so many, so looking overseas for new opportunities was a sound family strategy. In the end, 5 of the Shennan boys would come to New Zealand, as well as 2 of their sisters, who along with their husbands, settled there.
Watson arrived in Otago in 1857 aboard the Thomas and Henry from Melbourne, accompanied by his older brother Alexander. They were 22 and 24 respectively, young men on a mission and with the good fortune to make excellent local connections on arrival.
They immediately set off on an expedition into central Otago in search of land to run sheep on. Now this pastoral ambition ran counter to the founders' original vision of Otago as an agricultural economy of small farms. Otago's leaders had hitherto discouraged exploration inland. Sheep were already beginning to make Otago's fortune even before the discovery of gold, and the Shennan brothers were trailblazers pushing further inland in search of grazing land. After leaving the existing coastal zone of settlement, they found what they were looking for in the Manahirakia Valley, which they described as a land of promise.
They returned to Dunedin and took out a depasturing licence for 40,000 acres on Run 220, which they named Galloway, and some sort of lease arrangement for the neighbouring run, Moteri.
Taking their first flock of sheep inland in April 1858, the brothers were caught in a fierce snowstorm on the Lammerlaws. They then had to camp out on the treeless plain until huts could be built and guard their sheep by day and by night against the threat of wild dogs.
It was physically and mentally gruelling work, and Watson confided to his diary, "I do not think it possible to experience greater hardship and live."
Their hut, built on the banks of the Manahirakia River in June 1858 and later extended into a homestead, kitchen, store, stables and woolshed, was the first site occupied by a Pākehā settler in central Otago.
But despite the challenges, they had at least demonstrated the potential of the land for sheep.
This initiative was to provide lucrative returns. Others quickly followed the trail blazed by the Shennan brothers. A race for sheep runs in inland Otago took off, and a pastoral boom began in Otago, fueled by the profits from wool. In 1861, Alexander Shennan came back to Scotland to source better breeding stock. He travelled via Europe where he'd arranged to acquire some purebred merinos from the King of Prussia's prize-winning stud. He sent the sheep to Watson in New Zealand where they boosted the quality of Otago's flocks considerably.
Alexander, however, remained in Scotland to study at Edinburgh University. Sadly, he died there in June 1862, having caught typhoid. He is buried here in Kirkpatrick, Durham Parish churchyard, along with his parents and his fiancée.
Watson also returned to Scotland several times, including an 8-month stint in 1865 after he'd sold up his interest in those early Otago runs. From the late 1860s, however, he developed Puketoi Station here on the Maniatoto into the largest merino stud in New Zealand. His flocks here were to produce some of the finest wool in the world. This was only held on leasehold, however, so in 1878, he purchased and moved to the 14,000-acre freehold property, Conical Hill Station in West Otago, and here he became a wealthy and esteemed country squire, albeit perhaps a lonely one. In 1885, aged 50 by now, and with his hard pioneering days behind him, Watson took another trip back to Scotland. This time, he returned with a bride, 32-year-old Grace Burnett, who was the daughter of a Dumfriesshire Presbyterian minister who was Watson's cousin. They would have 4 children together, though sadly their firstborn, a son, died in infancy here in Scotland. In 1903, Watson retired to Dunedin, where he had built this fine mansion in High Street. It was named Threve after an historic castle in Galloway, and had sweeping views of the harbour and a ballroom in the basement. He also applied for his own coat of arms. At its centre was the figure of an explorer, all dressed for the road and ready to go. And for a motto, Watson chose the Latin phrase virtute duce, or in English, by virtue in the lead. Now that was a motto that he had really earned in those tough early years with his brother as they pushed their flocks inland and took all that the harsh environment of central Otago could throw at them. Watson died here at Threve in 1920, aged 85. He was survived by his wife Grace and 3 adult children. Now the property at Puketoi and the Merino Stud carried on under Grace's supervision until they were sold in February 1940. But really you could consider Watson Shennan to be one of the founding fathers of southern pastoralism.